Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention, we are going to proceed with the main event, and it is my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Ambassador Ken Juster, who was most recently U.S. Ambassador to India and who's had a fascinating career that has straddled government service and Wall Street. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Juster.
Thank you very much, Noel. And he forgot to mention that many years ago, we practiced law together at the same firm. So this is a nice reunion to be back here. I have the privilege of introducing our first honoree, Charles Emond, the President and Chief Executive Officer of CDPQ, a global investment group with over 430 billion Canadian dollars in assets, offices in 9 countries, and investments throughout the world. CDPQ invests constructive capital in private equity, equity markets, private credit, real estate, and infrastructure. Indeed, it's the largest infrastructure investor in the world. As President and CEO, Charles is responsible for the strategic direction of the organization, including positioning CDPQ in Quebec, where it is based, and in international markets to deliver optimal performance for its depositors. Charles assumed his current role in 2020, having previously served as CDPQ's Executive Vice President for Quebec, Private Equity, and Strategic Planning. His immediate challenge was effectively managing and maintaining the morale of a large organization with worldwide offices during the COVID-19 pandemic. Charles passed this test with flying colors. During his tenure, Charles has sought to create a unifying culture for CDPQ and has implemented several important initiatives to transform the firm's portfolio to perform at a high level in today's complex environment, as well as to position CDPQ for the future. In addition to advancing the organization's role and impact in Quebec, Charles has expanded CDPQ's international standing by leveraging the organization's broad network to seize the best investment opportunities. Among Charles's many projects, he has led the execution and commissioning of the longest automated light rail system in the world across Greater Montreal. This is an historic and sustainable transportation system. In fact, Charles has raised the level of CDPQ's ESG ambitions and its leadership in sustainable investing. Prior to joining CDPQ in 2019, Charles worked for nearly 20 years at Scotiabank and Scotia Capital, where he held the positions of Executive Vice President for Financial Affairs and Global Head of Investment Banking and Capital Markets. He also served as the Chairman of the Board of the investment management firm Jarislowsky Fraser. As part of Charles's current effort to expand CDPQ's international profile and investment opportunities, I had the good fortune, in my capacity as senior advisor to the organization, to accompany him at meetings with government and business leaders in the United States, in India, in the United Arab Emirates, and with the leadership at the World Bank and the IMF. It has been impressive to see him in action. Warm and relaxed in demeanor, Charles has a penetrating intellect and is full of insightful observations and comments. Other leaders really enjoy talking with him and learning from him. His views were repeatedly sought on financial markets and investment trends, as well as on managing a large organization with a global employee base. Charles always has a perspective worth listening to, and it was a treat to be along for the ride. It is therefore with great pleasure that I introduce Charles Emond, President and CEO of CDPQ, to present him with the 2024 Foreign Policy Association Medal. Charles. Yeah.
Thank you, Ken, for your kind words. In fact, after such kind words, I'm not sure if I'm still warm and relaxed, but anyways, and thank you to the Foreign Policy Association for this award. The theme of economic prosperity is one that is at the heart of what we believe in and stand for at CDPQ. But I'll get back to this in a few minutes. I meant to tell you I was actually giving a speech in Montreal last week, and the topic was about CDPQ's significant transformation since the pandemic in 2020, a year that changed a lot of things for all of us in this room and everyone around the world. And Ken mentioned it. It was the year I became CEO of this great institution. Now, needless to say, my original plan went as expected for about 1 month. More importantly, however, preparing for that speech kind of forced me to take a step back and take the full measure of all that we've achieved on so many fronts at CDPQ in those last 4 years. One of the many initiatives we've put forward during these last 4 years, and I wish to highlight tonight, stems from the significant transformation of the geopolitical environment and how we must now, as investors, factor that in when we invest, or how we must address it when problems arise. Even more so, as Ken said, with assets of $430 billion in 70 countries. You all know that today's world is increasingly complex, so it became clear to me that we had to build fast our own capabilities to better maneuver in this new environment. And this has led to the creation of what we call CDPQ Global, something I'm very proud of. It's a team of in-house specialists, ex-ambassadors like Ken and others, that focuses on 3 things: a better coordination both internally between our offices around the world, but also externally with our partners. And that also consistently promote our interests by managing the political and regulatory channel with respect to the private assets we own around the world. And also opening doors to Quebec businesses to help them navigate international markets. But also the other way around too, supporting global companies, including from the US, looking to do business back home in Quebec. 4 years later, we as an organization display greater cohesiveness, we have more impact, and we're more agile. And it's actually paid off so far, as we've been able to seize opportunities faster in a more competitive environment and better defend our clients' interest in a more challenging world. Quickly on the macro environment, we all know global collaboration is key. We're facing trade tensions, supply chain disruptions, with structural shifts in the economy and a profound geopolitical fragmentation. This context forces investors like us to adapt and manage a high degree of uncertainty. And in times like these, associations like FPA are essential. They're essential to cultivate a better understanding of global issues and to engage the right stakeholders in the right discussion. And as we know, close ties between North American reliable trading partners drive mutual economic prosperity. And for me, for my organization, CDPQ, economic prosperity is at the core of who we are and what we do every day. As Ken pointed out, we have a unique dual mandate. So what does that mean? It means first, we got to generate optimal returns for our clients. Our clients represent 6 million Quebecers out of a population of around 8. But also while contributing to the development of Quebec's economy. So we invest what we like to call constructive capital. What is constructive capital? Constructive capital aims to do 2 things. It combines performance, returns, with progress. And progress we define as positive impact we're having, hopefully in communities where we invest. So by doing so, we're looking to create a lasting effect on the economy for generations to come in and outside of Quebec. How do we do that? Well, first, we try to work on large projects like the REM that have a multiplier effect in terms of productivity and quality of life and benefit to the economy. The REM is that big transportation project that Ken alluded to, $8 billion that's turning out at 67 kilometers to be the longest of its own in the world ahead of Dubai. Secondly, we try to go above and beyond and support sectors that are essential to our collective future prosperity. And last but not least, invest in leading Quebec companies that do well abroad and create great jobs for our North American neighbors and trading partners. Today, 70% of our $400 billion plus is in North America. 40% alone here in the US, our largest investment destination by far, something we're very proud of. And North America is and will remain our home market. It's a unique place to invest for many reasons that will continue to provide investors like us superior long-term risk-adjusted returns. And why is that? North America has got an abundance of natural resources. Now has energy self-sufficiency. It's protected by 2 oceans with deep capital markets, rule of law, very attractive for human capital, and displays great innovation capabilities. So as a conclusion, I would like to simply say that to me, this award is a recognition of our team's effort and the difference we can make with our constructive capital investment approach. Some of our colleagues are here tonight. I want to thank them. Thank you, FPA, for your work. This video was very inspiring. And thank you for this award, which I'm very honored to receive. Thank you all for being here and enjoy this great evening. Thank you.
Good evening. I had very much looked forward to being with you this evening, but unfortunately, I have a mild case of COVID. Nonetheless, it is my great privilege to introduce my friend, Peter Orszag, for this evening's event. I first met Peter when I was at Treasury, at the early stage of my time at Treasury. And he was a young associate working for Joe Stiglitz, the Council of Economic Advisors. Midway through, or partway through, a very high-profile meeting, Peter passed me a note. He said I had made an error in some calculation that I was using in the presentation. 3 decades later, Peter is still correcting me, and on occasion, he's been right. Peter's had a remarkable career. He taught economics at Berkeley, and then went on to create the blueprint for what became the Hamilton Project, and he became the Hamilton Project's first director. That was a process that led to the creation of what is now a significant factor in economic policy development, which is to say, the Hamilton Project that Peter both designed and then first directed. He then returned to government, become the director of the Congressional Budget Office, and then he was President Obama's choice to be head of the Office of Management Budget in the beginning of President Obama's administration. In that context, he was a key architect of the Affordable Care Act, arguably one of the most important pieces of social and economic legislation of the last 5 decades. After leaving the Obama administration, Peter returned to the private sector, and now he is, of course, the recently named Chief Executive Officer of Lazard, the legendary investment banking firm. And in that respect, Lazard is in extremely good hands. Throughout his career, Peter has been actively involved in the intellectual marketplace in the debate about economic policy issues. He has brought to it a great and creative mind, and he is a generous colleague, prolific author, and a person of enormous integrity. It is now my great pleasure to present the Foreign Policy Association Medal to my friend, Peter Orszag. Peter, welcome.
I was going to use a line from LBJ. That's the kind of introduction that my mother would believe and my father would appreciate. Thank you, Bob, for that introduction. Bob has been a colleague and a friend for more than 25 years now. And it's at moments like this that the importance of people like Bob, who day by day and step by step make the journey not only more meaningful, but also more fun, really is reinforced. And on that note, I very much also want to thank my wife, Biana, for joining us tonight, along with my colleagues from Lazard and our clients. The Foreign Policy Association has a storied history of fostering awareness and informed opinion on foreign policy and global issues for over a century. And I am humbled to be included among the list of illustrious recipients who have been recognized by the association with this medal. Tonight's recognition is not just a personal milestone for me, but also in my mind, a testament to the importance of bridging the worlds of government and business. So many of the previous honorees, including Bob, have been people who played leading roles in both business and government, and that combination is what I want to speak about tonight. I have long been inspired by those who can do just that, combine insights from business, government, and academia to make society better. I very vividly remember in high school being particularly taken with the wise men, 6 friends in the world they made, in part because the leading figures so clearly and vividly embodied this ability to move across these fields, drawing insights from each to apply into the others. And today, the ability to successfully navigate these domains is crucial, as geopolitics is more central to the daily activities of business and investing, as we just heard, than at any time in recent memory. Indeed, there was a time when most of the corporate world could feel mostly separated from the foreign policy world. Private sector leaders outside of perhaps some sectors like oil and gas could generally build their businesses and expand their footprint without thinking much, if at all, about geopolitics. That's no longer true today. Furthermore, corporations are now not only the object of, but also a crucial instrument for the most important foreign policy challenges of our time. Whether we are talking about encouraging clean energy supply chains, or relocating key semiconductor fabs, or tackling cybersecurity, let alone shaping the impact of generative AI, foreign policy outcomes depend not just on public policy, but also on the actions of corporate decision makers. Whether semiconductor production actually increases in the United States, for example, following the CHIPS Act, depends not just on the policies to encourage more fabs to be built here, but also on whether major tech firms ultimately decide to buy the US-produced semiconductors rather than the alternatives, which are likely to remain cheaper for a very substantial period of time. More broadly, as my co-authors, one of whom is here this evening, Teddy Bunzel, and I recently argued in a Foreign Affairs article, the interdependence between business and government in determining foreign policy outcomes means a new set of skills are necessary for leaders in both sectors. In my own career, I have been fortunate to move between these worlds of government and business and think tanks. Through these experiences, I've seen firsthand, how to put it mildly, Washington on the one hand and Wall Street and the boardroom on the other are often in a kind of Mars-Venus type of situation. Talented people in each setting may not fully appreciate the challenges facing their counterparts in the other. Those who've had the privilege of serving in government appreciate the intricate machinery of policymaking and the delicate balance of interests that must be struck. It is often far harder than it may seem from the outside. The constraints, the trade-offs, and the multidimensionality of the problems that shape decisions that reach, say, the White House and affect millions of lives are often much harder, much more complex, and more subtle than they may seem at a distance from the boardroom. And those with the privilege of leading private sector firms bring a keen appreciation for the realities of the marketplace, the drivers of innovation, and the imperative of economic growth. But unlike the view that can sometimes seem to emanate from at least some on Capitol Hill, Corporate leaders are generally not spending their lives scheming and conniving, but instead focusing on building successful and sustainable businesses. I deeply believe in the power of business to make society better. That view may not be necessarily all that popular today, but without corporate innovation and productivity, we would all be dramatically worse off. None of that means that government policy is always ideal, or that businesses don't make mistakes or act unethically from time to time, or that the outcomes businesses produce do not depend crucially on the incentives and ground rules set by governments, which need not and should not always involve unfettered free markets. But I am here to say that no one has a monopoly on insight and excellence, and easy put-downs of either government or business lobbed from one side or the other are, in my experience, generally misleading. Both have essential roles to play. Over the course of my own career, I've seen this dynamic from both sides. As director of the Office of Management and Budget during the Obama times, I did not hesitate to reach out to corporate leaders as appropriate, including on key issues such as the Affordable Care Act that Bob mentioned, which was designed with much more private sector input in a manner that was often lacking from prior and unsuccessful, I should note, attempts at healthcare reform. Now, as the CEO of Lazard, it's clear that it's impossible today, both in our operations and as we advise clients, to take any important business decisions without incorporating geopolitical considerations. Lazard has always prided itself on this ability to combine business insight with strong engagement in public policy. From the groundbreaking work that Felix Royatin did on the New York City fiscal crisis almost 50 years ago today, to our new geopolitical advisory team that is helping our clients navigate today's complexities. Finally, I just want to end on a brief note of optimism, which is often lacking in these kinds of settings. Despite the many challenges the world faces, we should all simply marvel at the current state of innovation. We are living through truly exceptional times, from generative AI to the remarkable life sciences revolution that is producing unprecedented advances in oncology and other fields, to the dramatic advances in robotics. The list of things to be excited about is long and much needed. Many of these developments reflect precisely the combined impact of business, government, and academia that I found so inspiring in high school in the Wiseman. So, with a sense of that optimism, with deep appreciation for my colleagues, mentors, friends, and family, and with respect for this impressive organization, thank you again for this magnificent award. Bye.
We will now turn to Sir Mark Thompson, Chairman and CEO of CNN International.
Thank you, Noel. I'm here to introduce Shriti Vadera, my friend and colleague Shriti Vadera. I guess I met Shriti more than 20 years ago, definitely on opposite sides of the table, by the way. But I'm currently a kind of co-conspirator with her at the Royal Shakespeare Company, where she's chair and I'm deputy chair. And it's worth saying, I'll talk a little bit about the way Shriti does these things, but Shriti's been a magnificent chair, still fairly early in her period, I hope, but at a time of, in the world of theatre generally, but also at the RSC, very turbulent times coming out of COVID and all the rest of it, with changes of artistic directors, changes of program, changes of almost everything. And suffice to say that it turns out in theatre companies, not every bit of drama happens on stage, to say the least. But it's to just try and give you a pen portrait of Shriti at the get-go. She's an innovator. She's a lateral thinker and problem solver. She's characteristically an agitator for change on the front foot. And I think what I want to say, I think is most remarkable about her is that she's, people often divide into two groups, people who are great ideas people, great strategists, great writers of PowerPoints, and doers, people who can take all of that and in an operational way turn it into decisions and action and so forth. And Shriti, in my both direct and indirect experience, can do both. And you can point to her biography and see how she's done both. She's been a great advisor. She's been a great executive. And because of that, she's someone who can have an astonishing impact on organizations, as she is with several right now. And I mean, a word of warning, if you've got an organization, you're looking for leadership, but actually you want the organization to stay just as it is, and kind of go rolling, drifting gently along, she's not the woman for you. Hire her and stuff will happen quickly. But I think in many ways, Shriti, as a both a private and a public figure, epitomizes a lot of what Peter's just been talking about. She stands, astride many crossroads and has occupied successfully very many different roles. I mean, she's certainly someone who has moved from successfully from the public and the public to the private realms, comfortable both, in the world of economics and economic theory and policy and politics. She's been extraordinarily successful in a domestic setting in the United Kingdom. She's an internationalist and familiar with the wider world. Very comfortable in gatherings like this and in the kind of Western democratic capitalist settings, but also someone in touch with the developing world. But what's interesting, or one of the things that's most interesting about Shriti is her journey. Shriti has also been a refugee. She grew up in an Indian family in Uganda. That community was expelled and ended up I believe in fairly straitened circumstances in England, starting from absolute scratch. And there probably aren't many people in the room tonight who can say that. And from that, she's had the kind of career which in the UK is normally associated with people who have been born to it. A brilliant career at Oxford. She very rapidly became a top government advisor. She became a baroness sitting in the House of Lords, a government minister. When she moved to the private sector, director, company chairman, and she's currently also one of the major leaders of cultural institutions in the UK. Shriti played, and I know this both from watching her and in some ways covering her as a journalist. I also know it from some of the people she worked very closely with, including Gordon Brown, first Chancellor and then Prime Minister at the time. Shriti played a critical leadership role in the UK government's response to the financial crisis. She was a key architect of its pioneering bank recapitalization and funding plan, and also played a crucial role in the 2009 G20 London summit, which in that crisis actually was a moment, unfortunately increasingly rare, it seems to me, of genuine UK thought leadership on a global stage. And so when we think of the very sure-footed response of my country, that country, the UK, to the crisis, Shriti is right in the middle of that and deserves a lot of the credit. She's had a great career in corporate life, chairman of Santander UK, currently chairman of Prudential PLC. And as I've said, also, I think an inspirational leader of the Royal Shakespeare Company with, as you may discover, a great personal love and indeed knowledge of the works of William Shakespeare. But more than that, and I say just on a personal level, she's honestly got one of the best, most incisive, quickest minds I know. But she's fun to be with. She's funny and she's fun to be with. And it's a great pleasure to work alongside her. And it's also a great pleasure to present her now with a 2024 Foreign Policy Association Medal. Shriti, come up.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for your very generous words and for being here this evening, despite all the pressures on your time. I gather you have a small debate to arrange coming up shortly. Your presence means a lot. Thank you. And thank you to the Foreign Policy Association for this great honour, which is made even more so by sharing it with Peter and with Charles. I was, of course, delighted to accept when I heard from Noel. It did give me pause. I have rather more interest than expertise in foreign affairs. And then I read up a little bit and I saw that FDR once said that the Foreign Policy Association performs a high duty in facilitating the lucid presentation of the facts of world problems. Now, I'm not promising lucidity, but respectful of this duty, and notwithstanding that sometimes there is a contentious debate around the fundamental premise of climate change, particularly in the United States, I want to make some remarks about climate finance. And what I fear is turning out to be a convenient untruth about the role of private finance within that. It's an untruth that I believe is now coming in the way of urgently needed global solutions, already being crowded out from international policy debate, and a source of increasing distrust between emerging markets and developed countries. So with some apologies for simplification in a world of already rather muddy numbers, to limit global warming to 2 degrees or less, we need net additional climate finance of about 5 trillion a year from now to 2050. That's, in effect, doubling the current flow. Of this, almost half is needed in emerging and developing countries, excluding China. In effect, quadrupling that flow. And it's proclaimed volubly that at least 50 to 60% of these needs need to come from the private sector. And that would be 10 times the current flow for clean energy investment in emerging markets. These private finance numbers are cited relentlessly, as if by saying it often enough, it might actually happen. But like in Henry IV, the wish was father to that thought. Given that annual global capital flows are about 230 trillion a year, you might say those numbers don't sound so implausible. But this multiplication of private flows, which is expected, is really for what are currently largely uncommercial risks and returns, or indeed, simply put, for financing a global public good. As if through some form of spontaneous combustion, private finance will start to fund at scale the externalities to itself. And more important than the absolute dissonance of scale, there's a huge mismatch about where and how private finance will be directed relative to where it's needed and in what form. Is it in debt, or more problematically, with even larger gaps, the higher risk-bearing equity? And will it go to where it's most acutely needed, emerging markets? Because now, a dozen emerging markets are amongst the top global emitters, and with China, they contribute about 70% of the flow of emissions. Before we're tempted into finger-pointing, let's remember we in the West created this problem. We emitted 70% of the stock of greenhouse carbon gases in the environment today on our way to prosperity. Emerging and low-income countries face a quadruple whammy. They've historically contributed the least. Geographically, they suffer the most. Financially, they need the most resource, but they attract the least. And economically, they have the least internal resource, competing for the most pressing of human needs. They, and therefore we, won't succeed if they're forced to make invidious choices with their domestic resources, or if we simply redirect static or indeed shrinking international resources away from other development needs. But we can't solve anything without them. Greenhouse gases recognize no borders. And every dollar invested in clean energy in emerging markets reduces emissions by 30% more than in advanced economies. It's the best argument today for global coordination and cooperation. And yet, in 2023, we saw a net outflow of funds from emerging markets, with private creditors withdrawing about $200 billion. So, while pressure from policymakers to climate campaigners, even customers, can make financial institutions divest from fossil fuel, they can't force these institutions to invest in mitigation and transition. In trying to face up to this reality, one solution in particular has been grasped in some places, using minimum public finances to leverage the maximum amount of private finance through risk sharing. G20 experts have recommended a target for increasing the ratio of private capital that multilaterals mobilize from about 0.6 to 1.5 to 2 times for every dollar that they provide. But in reality, we've stagnated at about a quarter of these levels of mobilization. There are many mechanisms to bridge the gap of what can be made commercial for the private sector, some easier than others. And that's why, to support practical solutions in this area, Ajay Banga set up last year the World Bank Private Sector Investment Lab, which I co-chair with Mark Carney. The World Bank's had an early success. It's committed to simplifying and trebling their guarantees to the private sector to $20 billion per annum by 2030. That's exciting. It's even important. But it's a tiny fraction of what's needed. And that's from the biggest multilateral beast on the block. A multilateral which itself has capital constraints, a vast array of priorities, from education to food security and everything in between. Even if it was rather more efficient, its shareholders, which is the governments of the world, can't expect it to leverage multiples more private finance into climate without taking on more risks and needing more capital. So, notwithstanding these efforts, what we need is clarity about what the private sector can really finance within the parameters that exist today, and what it can't. And so, change the parameters and face up to some hard alternatives. The first being, of course, that public finances fill the gaps, the parts that the private sector can't reach. Yes, deployed more efficiently for maximum impact, taxing dirty, subsidizing clean, all the while managing supply chain, trade, competitiveness, geopolitical constraints. But still at an order of magnitude for which we do not currently appear prepared. even with the exorbitant privilege of the reserve currency of the world, it's hard to magic up public finance with vertigo-inducing debt-to-GDP ratios, interest rates that are higher than we've been used to, and large competing spending pressures. But very likely we will need to find the fiscal space. With disciplined rules of borrowing and transparent expenditure on what improves productivity and what will reduce otherwise inevitable future costs to the public from climate change. In the end, convincing the markets to continue to lend to sovereigns may prove yet to be the greatest form of private capital mobilization, but one where developed economies will inevitably have the advantage over emerging ones. So this will need larger transfers from the public to emerging market transition plans in various forms. And that means convincing voters that helping to finance, say, Indonesia's energy transition is in fact in the best interests of our consumers and our national security. That's a hard, possibly impossible sell. Or we could try possibly a harder one, perhaps more rational. Introduce full carbon pricing mechanisms, which would create an asset class for tradable, scalable, liquid capital markets. And that would induce the world's largest private investors to provide the proportion of the untapped trillions that we need. Today, only about a quarter of carbon emissions are subject to a price. And that price is on average less than a quarter of what's needed. I appreciate that it's easier to sell the notion of green jobs than to inform voters that they're not paying the true cost of carbon that they're continuing to emit and consume. But it could be the one transformative change for financing the gap. A vital incentive, rather than today's multiple policy and regulatory disincentives to greater flows for climate change. I simplify this evening only to make the point that these problems are not beyond the wit of humankind to solve, but that the fig leaf that the private sector will spontaneously fill the gaps today is an active barrier to discussing what might really be needed. We risk a cycle of obfuscation at a point when we have the least time for misdirected efforts. I'm not as naive as I'm choosing to sound here today. The most important lesson I learnt from my time in government is that the counterfactual is very hard to prove to the public, and politicians will never be thanked for the price of prevention. As a senior European politician used to say when presented with rational policy options, we know what we have to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected afterwards. But perhaps my favourite playwright can persuade them that if you want all's well that ends well, they must recognise no legacy is so rich as honesty. Thank you for listening, and thank you to our hosts, the Foreign Policy Association, for a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating our extraordinary honorees. Thank you for joining us this evening. Get home safe. Good night.